Were the public right to kick all of you out?
I think they were.
Thank you very much to everybody, and good night.
No Conservative leader should be properly describing herself this way. The Rishi Sunak government wasn't really interested in doing anything about Brexit and didn't want to get the benefits of it. Cheap energy has been the driving force of economic growth. We now have a government that actively wants to lower people's standard of living because it's fussing about carbon dioxide emissions. There has been a crackdown on some rioters. They were quite happy to support violent protests by people they thought of as their mates.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and I'm delighted to be joined in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, you've been a Conservative MP, or you were a Conservative MP for 14 years. You were Business Secretary, Leader of the House of Commons. Your party went from a historic victory in 2019 to a historic defeat at the last general election. Were the public right to kick all of you out?
On balance, I think they were. I think that we had let them down. I thought our biggest mistake was getting rid of Boris Johnson. And this isn't actually particular about whether Boris was a good Prime Minister or a bad Prime Minister, good human being or bad human being. Personally, I like him and always got on with him. But he had the mandate.
Yeah.
People had voted for him. And I thought there was an arrogance in saying, well, you little voters, you may have voted for Boris Johnson, but we don't care. We're important MPs, and we don't like him anymore, so we're getting rid of him. And I thought that was a fundamental error because it was disrespectful towards the electors, and the electors ultimately are your employers.
And Brexit was obviously a key thing that led a lot of previously Tory sceptical people over into the Tory camp. You've obviously been a Eurosceptic for a very long time, perhaps your whole political career. But do you not think it's actually quite curious that it was the Conservative Party that was tasked with implementing that actually quite radical change to the UK?
Well, there was a problem, and this goes right back to the referendum, is that the referendum was opposed by the leadership of all the major political parties. And so the Conservative government was formally against Brexit and then had to implement it with a leader who had campaigned against Brexit. And that was always going to present difficulties. And you had probably a majority of the parliamentary party who were against Brexit. Indeed, I think, if I remember rightly, 60% of Conservative MPs had come out saying they wanted to remain in the European Union. And that made the Brexit negotiation period difficult. But then Boris got a grip on that, changed that, was somebody in favour of Brexit. And that particular dial was beginning to turn until, of course, COVID hit.
Yeah. And you were Brexit Opportunities Minister. Do you think that we've missed a lot of opportunities? And in particular, did your government do enough to defend Brexit and the gains of Brexit from the sort of, I guess, endless barrage of complaints about it?
I think when the government changed, as when Liz Truss went, the Rishi Sunak government wasn't really interested in doing anything about Brexit.
Yeah.
And didn't want to get the benefits of it and did the terrible Windsor Agreement, which has made Northern Ireland subservient to Brussels and has made it very difficult to change VAT rates in the UK because we're not allowed to change them in wide areas in Northern Ireland. So I think that was a serious problem. I think there was another problem, which was the inherent bureaucratic nature of the British state. So we kept on having, whilst I was in government, an argument over imposing controls on goods coming into the UK from the EU, which were perfectly safe.
Yeah.
And the reason they wanted to impose controls was because that's what bureaucrats do. And so the chief vet was paranoid about Romanian pork. Well, just ban Romanian pork. Don't ban French pork, which is perfectly safe. But she would not have this. And I'm afraid they are getting their way and they are implementing these really stupid controls that put up the costs for consumers and an act of sabotage and self-harm. And so the bureaucratic impetus and wet ministers who were willing to go along with this was very damaging.
Presumably they weren't worried about Romanian pork when we were in the EU and importing exactly the same thing. Is it just the bureaucratic impetus takes over regardless of the situation?
Well, I suppose they weren't allowed to be worried about Romanian pork at that point. It's just there were a number of things. One is people thought, well, the EU does it to us, so we should do it back, which is a mind-numbingly stupid approach to trade. You want trade to be as free as possible, and one way free trade is economically beneficial for your consumers. And particularly people like the Chief Vet and DEFRA are captured by the producers. So they're always looking for protectionism effectively, and backdoor protectionism suits them. So that was part of it. The other part of it was, as we had with COVID actually, if you ask the experts, they're always going to go for the most career-protecting view. And the most career-protecting view is almost always to say no.
That sounds about right, definitely. And one thing that the Conservatives have been criticised a lot about, is widely seen as a reason you were rejected, was mass immigration. Now, I know a lot of people are concerned about that. But do you think there's a danger that some people on the right, I mean, you were asked recently, point blank, if Enoch Powell was right about the rivers of blood speech, and I think you handled this very well. Is there a danger that people on the right start to take up, I think what is actually a bigoted caricature from the left, that voters aren't just concerned about immigration, they're actually racist or anti-migrant? So you're worried about that risk?
I think it's been a great risk for the Conservative Party. I think that Enoch Powell's speech made it impossible to have an intelligent conversation about migration for decades afterwards. Its consequence was that it was harder to control migration than before he made that speech. But I think there is a sensible conversation to be had, and that it is urgent. We need to get migration down into the tens of thousands that Dave Cameron promised. This is possible to do. But you have to look at who is arguing for immigration. It's primarily legal migration. Illegal gets all the attention, but numerically it's a fraction of the problem of the issue. And you get a lot of special pleading from businesses who want to pay low wages. And we should be saying the UK economy's route to prosperity is as a technologically advanced, innovative, automated economy. And that if your business is dependent on cheap labour, you should offshore it. It shouldn't be operating from the UK. I made this point about fruit picking. If it is not economic to pick fruit in the United Kingdom, those fields should be turned over to corn, and the fruit pickers should stay in their home countries and pick fruit in those countries which we should import. This is the comparative advantage. This is the Adam Smith, the David Ricardo approach to trade and economic management, rather than thinking that everything should happen in the UK and that you should make things more expensive for consumers by doing it this way, but also have the problems that come from mass migration.
We've had some very serious rioting recently in the UK. The Labour government has been cracking down not just on rioters and people who've been inciting violence, which I'm sure everyone would agree with, but there's also been a broader crackdown on speech. There's talk of the police recording more non-crime hate incidents, or the Online Safety Act being extended to include legal but harmful speech, whatever that quite means. Do you worry that this has the potential to be a quite authoritarian government?
Well, let's divide up what you said into two constituent parts. First is the crackdown on rioters. There has been a crackdown on some rioters. Bear in mind that Keir Starmer took the knee after the Black Lives Matters protests had turned violent and a statue had been toppled over in Bristol. They were quite happy to support violent protests by people they thought of as their mates. They are not in favour, and nor should they be in favour, of the violence that erupted over the summer. Now, I'm much more consistent on this. I think that all violence should be treated with the full force of the law, and it doesn't matter what the political motivations are, it is illegal and should be stopped. I'd say the same about the Notting Hill Carnival. Now, where are the emergency courts for the stabbings and for the 130 or whatever it was arrests at the Notting Hill Carnival? What happened there? Well, they don't care about that. Why? Because that's socially inclusive and they want to encourage that. They don't care about disorder. So I'd first of all dispute your point that Labour is tough on violence. It isn't. It's tough on some violence, and it ought to be more consistent. And Keir Starmer ought to apologise for taking the knee. It was a shameful thing to do, really foolish thing to do, and showed that there was some violence that he actually approved of. Then when you come to freedom of speech, freedom of speech is important, but it's not absolute. So, ought you to be able to say views that others find offensive? Yes. Ought you to be able to encourage violence against individuals? No. Or groups. So, somebody has been prosecuted, I think, has even pled guilty to a charge of incitement to racial hatred, calling for hotels to be burnt. That I don't think is unreasonable, that we are not a society that allows you to call for people to be killed. If, on the other hand, you say that mass migration should be stopped, that is a legitimate view. If you say that you think that mass migration was part of the reason for the riots, that is a legitimate view. Views that others find distasteful are legitimate.
And do you think there is a sort of growing, authoritarianism towards those kinds of views? Those views that I think we would agree are legitimate, but perhaps offensive to some.
Clearly, there is. I mean, you've seen the banning of Twitter in Brazil. You've seen some Looney Tune who used to serve Bill Clinton called for Musk to be arrested.
Yes.
And the hard left, whether in the United States or in the UK, do not like freedom of speech because people use their freedom of speech to point out the hard left are hypocrites.
I want to ask you about identity politics and wokeness. I'm sure you'll have heard the criticism that the Conservatives had 14 years to deal with some of the structural issues that have risen, that have led to that. Could have potentially changed the Equality Act, reformed the civil service, taken on some of the quangos. But actually, isn't it much worse than that? Haven't there been far too many senior Tories who have actually actively pursued the woke agenda?
So slightly no and yes. Difficulty for any government is that you can only do what there is a political appetite to do at the time. And the sort of cuddly equality, diversity, inclusion stuff was almost unchallengeable. Everybody was going along with it. Everyone thought it was fine and it was about being nice to people and being friendly, etc. And governments can't come in and say, right, we're getting rid of all this.
Yeah.
Because they just look too hard-nosed and people haven't worked out why it's a problem. The Equality Act, it was a mistake to implement parts of it after 2010 in the coalition agreement, when parts of it could simply have been ignored. But I don't think a government could have got through the repeal of the Equality Act in the circumstances of the last Parliament. I would have loved to repeal the Equality Act. It's a terrible piece of legislation. And I think that should be in a Conservative manifesto in future. But I think that's only because people have now seen what the problems are. On your second point, which the answer is yes, there have been some senior Conservatives who bought into this. I mean, including Theresa May, who's followed the whole green agenda and did this thing on net zero by 2050.
Described herself as woke recently, I think.
Oh, did she? Well, no Conservative leader should be properly describing herself as woke.
I want to ask you again about a bit more about Labour. And actually, you just mentioned the green agenda in particular, because the Labour government has two main goals, overarching goals for the economy. One is growth, and the other is to turn Britain into a clean energy superpower. Do you think net zero and growth can ever really mix?
No, not at all. The cheap energy has been the driving force of economic growth as far back as you can go in history. Why is the UK the engine of the Industrial Revolution? It's because we've worked out how to use coal. It's actually because we've run out of wood. Because we've run out of wood, we need other energy sources, and we therefore discover that we've got coal and we use it and we work out how to use it. It's actually, necessity is the mother of invention. Hence the need to use coal, hence the Industrial Revolution. Then you discover that you've got oil and gas, both of which lower the price of energy, make it more transportable, lead to massive economic growth and the improvement of standards of living. We now have a government that actively wants to lower people's standard of living, wants to make them colder and poorer because it's fussing about carbon dioxide emissions. It's completely wrong-headed and damaging because the UK doesn't make a blind bit of difference.
Just 1% of all global emissions. Then.
If we all stopped breathing, it wouldn't make any odds.
You've been involved in public life for a considerable amount of time. You've met prime ministers, I believe, stretching right back to Ted Heath. Is that correct?
Again, better than that. I actually met both Harold Macmillan and Alec Douglas-Home. So I've met every Conservative leader back to, not actually in office, because they're before I was born, but every Conservative leader back to Macmillan.
Absolutely brilliant. But one public figure I did want to ask you about, I don't even remember this, but you did an interview with Ali G.
Oh, yes, indeed. Who, when I got the letter from Channel 4 suggesting the interview, was called Ali Gupta. The Upta bit fell off between interview and appearance.
Wicked. I is here with Lord Rees-Mogg, and we is talking about class. Lord Mogg is going to tell us how we all can be upper class, can't we?
It was very kind of you to promote me to the nobility, but of course I'm not. My father is Lord Rees-Mogg, and I'm just a commoner like everybody else.
I wonder, was there a moment at all when you realised that, or when you twigged that he might have been having you on, or was it just a bit of fun?
Not at all. I just thought he was most peculiar and couldn't understand half of what he was saying to me.
Would I be upper class if I got a top hat and wore it?
Well, would you like to try? I have a top hat. I can lend it to you for the next few minutes of this interview, if you'd like.
Your interviewing style is much easier.
Oh, thank you very much. And finally, what's next for Jacob Rees-Mogg, and when can we expect to see the reality show?
Oh, what's next? Well, I've got GB News Monday, Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock, which I love doing. I am doing a programme with Discovery Plus, which I think is provisionally called At Home with the Rees-Moggs.
Excellent.
And that's fascinating, and be an insight into quite how routine my life is. I think people will be disappointed that it's not as much Downton Abbey as they might hope. But no, that's interesting. That will be out sometime later this year, perhaps early next year.
Excellent. Well, we'll all look forward to that. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.